Hello, hello. I wanted to record a quick kind of masterclass-ish, information-ish type of thing, talking about a question that I see and hear a lot from clients and from anyone on my Instagram page about why we feel worse often before we feel better once we start doing nervous system work. So let's jump into it. So a little bit about me just quickly. My name is Kate. I am a nervous system coach, and I started my business after it took me years and years and like tens of thousands of dollars of debt to figure out how to heal, realizing that so many of my symptoms were tied to my nervous system, and even those that weren't, my nervous system regulation gave me the baseline from which I knew how to approach those other symptoms as well. I found in my own research and my experience that so many practitioners either focus on quick fixes or they focus on kind of digging into the past, this psychodynamic approach, rather than registering safety, deeply felt safety in the present. And so I launched my program, which has had great success to date, and developed Soma Neuroalignment, which is our unique approach. And there's some more videos on my YouTube channel about that if you're interested. So let's just kick it off quickly with a super high level explanation of dysregulation, right? So in our autonomic nervous system, we have our sympathetic and our parasympathetic kind of arms or branches. And our parasympathetic you can think of as like rest, digest. Our sympathetic you can think of as our fight, flight, freeze response, kind of our survival mode responses. And so when we become dysregulated, there's an imbalance here. There's a skew towards the sympathetic, and we're unable to kind of get ourselves back to that parasympathetic, that calmer state. Either we can't get ourselves back there for a very long amount of time, or we kind of get stuck in a sympathetic state. And we're going to talk through a little bit more what being stuck looks like and why we might get stuck in a fight flight versus a freeze in a second. And so I want you to kind of picture this, right? You're super pumped. You get started in like somatics and in body awareness, vagal toning, parts work, all this stuff. And you're doing the things and you're sticking with them and you're like, whoa, like I'm experiencing my body in this whole new way. And then you start to feel way worse, right? You start to feel like your symptoms are getting worse, like they're keeping you up more. Like your body is super activated, and this can be incredibly defeating, which is why I wanted to record a video on this. Now, we're going to talk through kind of why that happens, why we may feel worse before we get better. But I just want to first start by saying that this experience is so common. And so I hope that kind of validates if you're going through this or if you start this work and experience this. Because when we start to feel our symptoms, our body, we come into the body more, we're going to notice things more. And this is going to make it feel a lot more intense. Now, of course, we spent years and years, often if we've run into dysregulation, trying to avoid, repress, push away, not look at certain experiences in our bodies and minds. We've tried to force ourselves to change our thoughts. Maybe we've done some CBT and found it's really defeating to kind of just jump to a different belief. Maybe we've tried to force ourselves to meditate or visualize and we feel like we can't get into it, right? There's something there, there's a reason there that your body has kind of pushed you out of being able to get into these states. And we're going to talk through that just a little bit more. So polyvagal theory and the polyvagal ladder, right, are a really important foundation for understanding our nervous system healing and what it can look like. And we're going to talk through the kind of three different states. But what's interesting here, right, is that we're talking about a ladder, that our goal is to essentially climb up the ladder. We want to get to this ventral vagal, which is at ease, calm and collected and connected. And what's key here too is that we won't always feel that way, but in a ventral vagal state, we can pretty quickly re-regulate ourselves when something stressful happens. But when we look at this ladder, we see that there's kind of different rungs that we have to go through. And so why we start to feel stuck is we get further and further away from this ventral vagal, and we start to live in this either the sympathetic or eventually this dorsal vagal state. And we start to get used to living in that level of stress. We can't really see our way out of it. So in the ventral vagal, right, this is kind of where you're moving your way up to. You feel connected with others. You feel like if your kid is playing that you can actually experience that joy, or if your partner cooked you dinner, you can be present for that. You feel like you can regulate your emotions effectively. And emotional regulation does not just mean being happy and content all the time, but instead, when things come into your world that kind of rock the boat, you are able to come back to an understanding of yourself, an understanding that you are safe, the ability to navigate through that and allow it to go through you instead of dissociating or pushing away or kind of avoiding. And generally, you feel pretty calm and relaxed. I think what we picture as calm and relaxed is often different than the experience of being in ventral vagal. We may picture just kind of like vacation mode and cruisy and chill, but what it more is an understanding that you'll be okay. That none of this stuff is actually going to cause a threatening situation to you, that aggressive email your boss sent is more their problem than yours. And so there's really this assurance and knowing of yourself and knowing of how you're going to navigate situations going forward. But in that sympathetic state, right, so it was ventral vagal and then we go to sympathetic. So the kind of one underneath ventral vagal or before you get there, we're feeling a lot of anxiety and overwhelm and irritability. We may notice things like faster breathing, more alertness or hypervigilance, right, getting scared easily, feeling always on edge. And for some individuals, this looks like big panic attacks, but for others, it looks like a consistent lull of anxiety throughout your day, and then a combination of all of the above. This is where we can experience lots of gut symptoms. We can feel like we're shooting awake at 3 a.m. And so we're in this very activated fight-flight state where we're almost ready for danger at any moment. And in fact, our mind is kind of predicting danger. So not only are we ready for it, but we're expectant of it. And therefore, we continue to live in this kind of high volatility state. Now, what's key here is that chronic activation of the sympathetic state can eventually start to shut us down. And this is how we're going to move down the ladder into our dorsal vagal state. And so dorsal vagal is this kind of chronically fatigued, chronically low cortisol, constant sense of disconnection and inability to be present, dissociation. And what we find in this state is that it really is an inability to get yourself, to motivate yourself to get out of it. So this is the hardest state in a lot of ways to be in, even though you feel it the least because you're dissociated and numbed out, right? They're all hard, but in terms of getting yourself out of it, this one's difficult. And the thing that makes it even more difficult is that you are going to move your way up through the sympathetic before you even get to that ventral vagal. What's key here is that most of us fall somewhere in between, somewhere in the middle. And so you've probably or maybe heard the phrase like functional freeze. And it's this mode where you might absolutely crush it at work, but then you come home and like crash on the couch and just kind of dissociate or binge watch Netflix. It might be this kind of mode where you're the best mom in the world, but when it comes to actually sitting with yourself, you kind of zone out, you can't do it. Or when it comes to connecting with your partner, you feel like you're almost behind like an ice cube, that you can see them, but you can't really reach through. And this is where most of us get versus a full dorsal vagal shutdown. Now, myself personally, I did experience a full dorsal vagal shutdown. I was bedridden. I wasn't sure I was going to make it, and it became really a life or death situation. However, most of us kind of approach nervous system work before we get all the way to that shutdown point. But if you are watching this video and approaching it from that shutdown, I hope that also gives you validation that you can absolutely climb your way up the ladder with the right approach and with the right technique. And so let's go back to this image of the ladder, right? So we have the dorsal vagal, we have the sympathetic, and somewhere in the middle, right around this arrow in the middle, between those two states, you would find like a functional freeze. And so many of my clients come to me in that functional freeze state or even in more of that dorsal vagal. And what they find is they start to do these activities, these techniques that make them more aware of their body. And in that awareness, we start to notice the things that we had often been dissociating from intentionally to not feel them so much, right? If we have been living in that sympathetic state for a while, so much so that eventually our bodies start to shut us down, numb us out to it, because we can only live in that activated of a state for so long Then, once we start to come back into the body, you can only imagine. These are the symptoms, these are the experiences, the thoughts, the rumination that we had dissociated from in the first place before we started this work. So of course they're going to feel terrible. They're going to feel unfamiliar. And in some ways, dissociating will have felt easier than being in a purely sympathetic state. One analogy I like to understand this is picturing an animal that's caged, let's say like a dog. And when you first put that animal in the cage, they're going to fight their way out. They're going to get aggressive. They're going to, try and break the lock or whatever. But over time, once they see that they're barking and their attempts to kind of rock the cage aren't working, they're going to become a bit disengaged with the situation. They're going to shut down a bit. And this is because ultimately the stress of being in that cage, right, can only be lived in for so long before it takes too much energy. It's too difficult on the system. And so we go into this dissociative shutdown mode to avoid feeling the pain of our present situation any longer. Unfortunately, when we go there, it makes it difficult, right? We have to kind of jolt things back up. Get back up to that point where we can experience things. We have the capacity to experience that stress in the moment. And then from there, heal what we can feel, right? So when we feel that stress, it's a good thing because we can heal it if we can feel it. When we are shut down, it may feel in some ways easier to stomach or to manage, but we're not able to feel it enough to truly process and release it rather than just continue to not look at it. One kind of example that was really important for me, who kind of used to pride herself on the fact that I don't cry, right? I hadn't cried for years. I wasn't the type of person who cried. And honestly, I kind of judged people who cried easily, whether at movies or in like fights or whatever. When I came out of my dorsal vagal or even my more functional freeze, I cried for weeks. And it was the first time in a while I remember feeling grateful that I was crying because I had this information to know that this was a step in the right direction. But let me be clear, in a lot of ways, it felt much worse and much less productive to my life, my career, my relationships, etc., that I was living in such a state of activation and ultimately for me, a lot of sadness and confusion. But from that state, I was able to then heal those things and move into a ventral vagal and expand my window of tolerance to better handle stress. So giving you all of this information, right, there's kind of always this question of like, what do I do then, right? And you will find on my channel that there are other videos about techniques and approaches that I use and all of that. But in this video, what I want to talk about as a kind of general step is that we're looking to expand our window of tolerance. So this is a graph of healing, right? A kind of demonstration of how when we're healing, things are non-linear, even though we're always moving up towards the ultimate goal and we are getting better. So when we look back from that spot, that dot at the very end of the graph, down to when we started, we're like, damn, we have made a lot of progress, right? But when we are at maybe the second dip, we feel like, oh my God, like this is really hard. I'm similar to where I was. And a reminder that our minds are predictive. So what we use to predict our future is always informed by our past. We can start to feel like we're backsliding, like we're going in the wrong direction. And so this, if nothing else, is a reminder that when those instances happen, it's simply a part of the process of eventually leveling out to the point where you're not having such severe dips, right? So when we're talking about how we address or approach moving ourselves out of the ladder, what we're really talking about from a higher level is this concept of window of tolerance. And this is this optimal state of arousal where we can really function against stress and re-regulate ourselves quickly. I think when we see the way that sometimes nervous system regulation is marketed to us or sold to us on Instagram, it feels very like the ultimate goal is just to live in like peace and happiness and no issues, right? And what we know is that part of the human experience, and honestly, when you're not in it, what makes life very fun is the failures and the conflicts and the ways that you see yourself resiliently navigate through that. When we have an expanded window of tolerance, we're able to tolerate more stress. And this does not mean repressing it or ignoring it, but instead that it doesn't rock our world so much, that we can come back to ourselves, that we can come back to an understanding of ourselves, and that we don't go into a reactive response like being angry, being frustrated, yelling, or go into a response that feels much more like a freeze, dissociating, shutting down, running out the door so we don't have to deal with it. And so when we look at that window of tolerance, we're working between a hyperarousal and a hypoarousal. And this is why I say, as much as the polyvagal ladder and theory in general is really helpful for understanding why we may feel worse before we feel better if we're coming from more of that functional freeze state, what's really going on as a human being is that you're kind of up and down that ladder, right? That you are moving in and out of similar situations. But what's key here is that not every experience of stress and anxiety or feeling like you just want to curl up in a ball and watch a movie is full-blown a stuck state of dysregulation. We may experience little moments of dysregulation. We may also just experience little moments of stress and activation that aren't as far as sending our nervous system into a stuck state. When we get stuck, when we feel like we're truly in a state and identify by that, as the polyvagal ladder shows, what we're talking about is having lived in that state for so long that it becomes our norm in how we respond to our world and our external circumstances, as well as how we respond to ourselves internally. When we're outside of this window of tolerance, our bodies respond by going into survival mode. They don't know how to kind of come back from that. It doesn't feel safe enough to tolerate through, and therefore it's a threat. And so we feel unsafe, and in that unsafety, we find a way to protect ourselves. And these are biologically wired into us, as well as protection mechanisms created by our beliefs that were instilled in us from a young age, by watching other adults, by the way that we thought about the world, by what happened to us. So in order to truly heal and then eventually move on from living and healing and identifying by healing every day for the rest of your life, we're expanding that window of tolerance. One of my assistant coaches, Emma, calls it stretching your nervous system, right? And we're kind of walking that line between what's pushing a little too far and what is actually a healthy amount of showing ourselves that it's okay. This is why I always do recommend working with somebody that can help you to navigate that so that you don't send yourself too far in one direction or shelter yourself too much out of fear of what could happen. And titration here is really key. Slowly working our way up to these types of practices, to the ways that we push ourselves a little bit further, and knowing when to do so. So if nothing else, taking from this video that reframe of when the days feel tough, looking at the days that have felt incredible, looking at the days that have felt like, man, I am getting somewhere and I am truly helping my system move forward from this stuck state, from this way of being. Remembering that a bad day or a day that doesn't feel so good is not an indication of where you are, and to look at the larger graph, to look at the larger picture, to motivate yourself to keep moving forward. You got this.